Although my expertise throughout my career was working in counterterrorism, I worked human trafficking before I went to DC with the FBI. And I started when I retired. I started teaching college at the University of Tennessee, and I was looking for jobs on Indeed for students, and would always send them these positions that would be opening up. And I saw this human trafficking volunteer position with this organization called Hope for Justice, which is an international organization combating human trafficking. So went and met with them and grabbed a book. And on the cover of this book was a 12-year-old girl who had been sexually exploited since she was 6 years of age. And I took this book home and I had it sitting on my coffee table. And I've been pondering getting involved in working human trafficking. And at the time, I had a 12-year-old daughter, and she bebops down the stairs and she picks up this book and she says, "Dad, is this something that you're thinking about doing?" And I says, "Yeah, I'm thinking about doing it." And she goes, "Well, thank you." And she goes, "I love you," and kissed me on the cheek and walked out of the room. And I felt a little bit puzzled. And my wife looked at me and she goes, "I don't guess you're thinking about doing this anymore, are you?" And I said, "No." I said, "I've got a daughter that is the average age of exploitation, which is between the ages of 12 and 14. And I quickly realized that these statistics that we're going to talk about today, these numbers that we're going to talk about today, are people, their kids, their mothers, their sisters, their aunts, their grandmothers, their men, women, children with names. That's what they are. And that really impacted me. And I felt it was important for me to go on my own personal crusade, if you will, to raise level of awareness in regards to this and what we try to do to educate people on human trafficking. So aside from also to teaching human trafficking, I also teach. I'm a research professor for the University of Tennessee system. I also do a lot of human trafficking research with Baylor University, their Human Trafficking Research Center. But I work with this nonprofit called Hope for Justice. And what Hope for Justice does is we're at multiple locations across the globe. We look to end modern day slavery through preventing exploitation, preventing it from happening, understanding what those vulnerable communities are that exist out there, and educating people on how to recognize who these victims potentially could be to stop it before they are trafficked. We also look to recover and rescue victims. We have licensed private investigators across the globe who are retired law enforcement that go out and actually work cases off of referrals from people like you that may identify or suspect somebody being trafficked. We work closely with law enforcement and to try to locate and build cases against traffickers. We also look to restore lives. We know that when you rescue a victim, that that's not the end of the event. The event is really the process, because as you guys know, there's a great deal of trauma that is associated with this. And we'll talk about that in next week's session, and the polyvictimization and the different silos of trauma that these individuals go through. They're not just physically abused. They're not just sexually abused. They're not just psychologically abused. They don't just have substance abuse. They've got all of these things, which makes it more difficult for them to transform their lives. And another thing is reforming society, putting some teeth on the law, making it more of a criminal offense, but then also raising the level of awareness so people realize this is happening in their backyard. It's not something they see on TV. So what is human trafficking, Richard? What is it? Okay, here's the Department of State definition of human trafficking. And I use the Department of State's definition of human trafficking because we developed the training for the Department of State that is delivered across the globe in regards to it. So I like to go in line with them, but I bolded the three words that you really need to know what it is. Human trafficking really is obtaining a person for labor or services or sexual exploitation through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. So when we talk about that, force, fraud, and coercion, I'm going to give you some examples of that so you really know what force, fraud, and coercion is. The only difference, the only deviation to this definition would be child sex trafficking. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. Let me make sure everyone understands that. If you were under the age of 18, you are being sexually trafficked because under the age of 18, you are not of the age to give consent. So when the victim is a minor, it doesn't require proof that anyone used force, fraud, and coercion. It just requires the fact that they're under the age of 18. So force, fraud, and coercion, what's that look like to you, right? So force could be physical violence, right? Physical assault, rape, confinement, starvation, restraint, okay, making them do that. Um, or the victim has succumbed to obviously being beat, assaulted, both physically and sexually. Fraud, misrepresentation. This happens a lot. When we talk about fraud, misrepresentation, we know that a lot of people, and we'll talk a little bit about grooming and online grooming. I want everybody to understand like 60% of trafficking victims met their trafficker online. So prior to being trafficked. So we'll talk a little bit about that. False promises, offering someone a better job, a citizenship, education, things like that. And then coercion, psychological intimidation, threats of harm to them, threats of harm to their loved ones, confiscating their documentation, forced substance abuse. When we talk about substance abuse and we talk about that type of thing, one of the victims that I had interviewed one time, I asked her, I said, Alice, have you always been addicted to heroin? And she says, no, Rich. She goes, I haven't always. I became addicted to heroin when I was being trafficked. One of the girls that was being trafficked with me offered it to me and said, here, this will help get you through your day. So I used it to get me through my day. I just wanted my day to be over. And my body became addicted to it. So not only was she dependent upon her trafficker for food and clothing and shelter, she became chemically dependent to her trafficker. So making it even more difficult. So traffickers will use substance as a means of control. Okay. So just because, and I really hate this when sometimes when I'm working with law enforcement, and sometimes I'll hear them say, and I'm retired law enforcement, so I'll say this. I hate it when the insensitivity of not recognizing the fact that someone is a victim, regardless of their substance abuse. And sometimes you'll hear them say, oh, she's just a crack whore. And that doesn't make them less of a victim. We've got to refocus and get a victim-centered approach to attacking this problem. So substance abuse is a means of control. And we have to understand that in this realm. Why is this important? So I'm going to break down some stats for you. 25 million people in the world are victims of human trafficking. We know this number is going to go up this year, particularly after COVID. We don't even know the effects that COVID had on human trafficking, but we know it exacerbated the situation greatly. 5 million victims are forced into sexual exploitation. 4 million are children. And why is this? It's $150 billion a year business. It's the second fastest growing crime in the globe, right behind the drug market. But it's increasingly approaching close to what narcotics are bringing in the country for several reasons. You can only sell that drug once, but you can sell that person over and over and over again. They are a reusable commodity. So where is this happening? So, these are just figures that kind of demonstrate the highest ranking states. Just because the state doesn't have a number on it doesn't mean there's no trafficking there, just so you're aware. It just means that they're not in the top 25. If you'll notice heavily over here on the Eastern Corridor, the majority of the states there have that. Multiple factors attribute to that. Trafficking patterns. Typically, traffickers use the same routes that drug traffickers use. Also, large city, dense population. So a lot of reasons why that's the aspect there. So what feeds the funnel? When we look at human trafficking, we have to talk about some of the vulnerabilities. Those individuals who are considered most vulnerable are those who are most susceptible to being trafficked. And everywhere the funnel looks different. But we do know that 3 of the things that are high contributors to that funnel are foster care, homelessness, and runaways. We know that 1 in 3 children are pushed into trafficking within the first 48 hours of being out on the street. And about, this was in November of this past year, we worked an investigation where this young girl she had all of the earmarks for someone who was highly susceptible to trafficking. She was very promiscuous online. She was talking to older men online. She had kind of a frictional relationship with her mother, single family home. Went from 8th grade to 9th grade, new school, new friends, a little insecure about herself. a lot of different variables that come into play. Her mother, took her phone away from her because she had caught her talking on Omegle to some older men, and she ran away Friday night at about 10:30. The mother didn't realize that she was missing until Saturday morning. She contacted law enforcement. Typically, law enforcement are not going to immediately jump to looking for runaways because of the resources. We started looking for her on Saturday. We located her on Tuesday. About an hour after she left the house on Friday night, she was picked up by a guy who took her to her apartment because he knew that she was alone. He had sexually assaulted her. He realized that people were in the neighborhood looking for her. He then transported her out to the countryside about an hour and a half away to his brother's house where there were several men, where she was located then. She was trafficked within the first hour. So she's just kind of an example of this runaway situation where 1 in 3 are lured into it within the first 48 hours. We know that homelessness, is survival sex. You got no food, no clothing, no money, and you'll do what you can to survive. Typically, we see this with the homeless population, and then foster care. We know that an upward of almost half of those in foster care have been trafficked. So globally, 75% of trafficking victims are female. So when we say that men are not trafficked, that's not true. It is mostly female, just so we are aware. So if you hear me refer to females and girls, it's just because that's the majority of it. 1.6 to 2.8 million runaways, okay, in the U.S. And if 1 in 3 are being trafficked, just do that math in your head. So 36% of runaways trade sex for a place to stay. So when we look at this, we can see how high risk runaway population is. The face of trafficking is definitely changing when we look at some of the things that students have access to that we most likely didn't have access to when we were children. The advent of the internet. 83% of sextortion cases happen over social media platforms. If some of you are not familiar with what sextortion is, sextortion basically is when a person is using, illicit photographs to extort an individual for more. And I'll talk about a case study in here a little bit later. Females make up about 80% of those sextortion victims. Sextortion and trafficking. Sextortion is a pathway to being trafficked. We know that since in the past 2 years, that explicit material online has gone up about 120%. That's astronomical. According to the FBI, there's been about 100% increase in internet-based crimes. Okay. And and I want to say, as a research professor, statistics are only as good as they are captured. So I want you to think about how underreported of a crime that this is. 82% of child predators admit learning about their victims or likes through their social media sites. So during a research study, I was interviewing a trafficker who was in prison. And as he explained to me, he said, Rich, he goes, it's very easy for me to meet these individuals online. I create a folder where I have conversation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's already preloaded. I just copy and paste into the chat box. He said before COVID, I was probably getting about a 6 out of 10. During COVID, I was getting 10 out of 10 response rate. He said it used to take me about a month or 2 to groom these victims. Now it takes me about 2 days, 3 days. He goes, people are longing for attachment. I go online. When that person responds to me, I go to their profile. I learn about who they are, what they like, what they dislike, what troubles, trials, tribulations they're going through. And I mask my conversation around that. I bond with them, I groom them, and then I promise them a better life. And it's that easy. And I was just flabbergasted. So what types of trafficking do we look at here in the U.S.? There's really 3 kinds we want to be concerned with here: forced labor, sexual exploitation, and domestic servitude. we're going to see forced labor obviously exacerbate as we see the crisis in the southwest border. This isn't an immigration debate. This is the fact that we've got a lot of people who are coming into the country who are vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to exploitation. Obviously, sexual exploitation, which takes many forms, online, offline, you name it, and then domestic servitude. Those individuals who might be here working in a domestic fashion. Human trafficking is not like what you see in the movie. Hollywood likes to shape things, and the media shapes things like this. How many people on here have seen the movie Taken? Probably close to everybody. People who are abducted to be trafficked is the rarest form. Okay. People are rarely abducted to be trafficked. If you see on TikTok that somebody's on there posting that if there's a zip tie on your card at Target, then they are looking to target you, to kidnap you, to traffic you, that's baloney. It doesn't happen. I've never worked a case where somebody was kidnapped from Target after they were profiled by a trafficker. They're not putting zip ties on car handles. It's too much work for them. They can easily talk to somebody online, meet them that way. So we want to understand that that's kind of a myth. Okay, less than 1% are abducted for trafficking. So when we look at what's myth or fact, let's talk a little bit about it. Human trafficking always involves the transportation of a person from one place to another. Not true. Transportation is not an element for human trafficking. Somebody can be trafficked on the same street they grew up with. Human trafficking and human smuggling are two different things. One of the big differences between human trafficking and human smuggling is one's voluntary and one's not voluntary. There's a lot of people who are volunteering to be smuggled into the U.S. Promise of a better life, seeking, refuge from violence, better opportunities, better education, healthcare, etc., jobs. Okay, they want to come here, but I've never seen anybody raise their hand to be trafficked. Okay, so different elements here. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that smuggling cannot morph its way into trafficking, and that is a big concern, particularly when we're looking at people who might be paying a smuggler to get them into the United States, because now they're here, and now they could become potentially in debt bondage, meaning they owe this smuggler X amount of dollars for getting him here. Now they got to find a way to somehow pay that off. So then that's how it can be morphed into trafficking. Majority of human trafficking victims are females and girls. True. Right? True. About 75%. Any minor engaged in commercial sex is a victim of human trafficking? Yes. Remember, minors can't engage in sex because of consent, right? So it's automatically trafficking. It is what we would consider no such thing as child prostitution. So when people say she's just a prostitute, no such thing if they're a child, by law. Okay, by law. If they get paid, they aren't victims. That's not true either. Sometimes traffickers will pay their victims a small amount of money just to keep them going for necessities, or if they give them things or so forth. Remember, the three key elements when we look at trafficking are force, fraud, and coercion, right? Are they being forced to do this? Were they coerced into doing this? Right? Or they psychologically being manipulated to do this. So when we look at some of the research behind this, we look at their different reasons why youth and why adults are trafficked. Certainly, we talk about the ease or manipulation of a young mind. Typically, girls who are trafficked enter the age of exploitation between 12 and 14. When they're more easily manipulated. Boys, a lot younger, 11 to 13. Okay. One of the key drivers to this, the recruitment of this, is they're easier to manipulate. Okay. The trafficker knows that. They're more naive, more susceptible to it. Compared to adults, children also have a greater need of protection, particularly when we're looking at those who might have run away from home, or those who might be in foster care, or those who might be out there for some other reason. They look for that protection, that basic needs, right? So they're looking to serve that, if you remember from Psych 101, Maslow's hierarchy, they're looking for the food, shelter, right? And they know that somebody can provide that protection, right? And then also too, kids are less, are actually more trusting of adults. They think that the adult's actually going to look out for their best interests, right? In fact, the case I just told you about of the 14-year-old girl who ran away, the gentleman who picked her up on the street said, "Hey, look, it's going to get cold tonight. You can sleep on my couch. I'll take care of you for the night. Tomorrow you can figure out what you want to do." Okay, so she trusted him, and he was coercive and manipulated her in regards to that. So often these signs can go unnoticed, and we'll talk about some of the red flags, what we want to look for, because recognizing these red flags can really kind of help us alert that there may be trafficking there. And I always tell people that, it's better to say something and be wrong than to not have said something and have been right, because that's one more day this individual has to live in exploitation. Now, there is no key indicator. You don't see somebody and there's like one indicator there, and then you're like, okay, that person's being trafficked. Sometimes it's a culmination, of indicators. I always tell people it's kind of like this. When we look at some of the risk factors here for trafficking, we think about it, kind of view it as like a chocolate cake recipe. I could ask each and every one of you for your recipe for chocolate cake. Every one of you is going to give me a different recipe, but at the end, I'm still going to have a chocolate cake. So there's not one ingredient. You don't just throw cocoa in a pan and it's a chocolate cake. But if you put cocoa in there, then you throw an egg in there, and you throw some flour in there, right? Throw a little oil in there. As we start compounding the risk factors, right, then we start developing that chocolate cake. So when we look at risk factors for trafficking, just because someone's poor doesn't mean that they're going to be trafficked. Just because someone has mental health issues doesn't mean they're going to be trafficked. Just because somebody has emotional distress or substance abuse doesn't mean they're going to be trafficked. But as we start compiling these risk factors and we start looking at those, obviously the more ingredients we have, the better chance we're going to make that cake. So we want to start thinking about some of these factors, particularly when we're talking to people, we're identifying potential victims. What exists, right? What exists in here that can cause this? And certainly when we look at each one of these, we can sit here and break them down individually. Lack of social support. If I don't have social support, I'm going to seek it because everybody wants it. So who's going to give it to me? And that's where I'm going to land at, right? Family dysfunction and lack of social support are certainly an issue, because if I'm not getting that structure at home, if I'm not getting that support at home, if I'm not getting that attention at home, where am I going to get it at? Okay. Because everyone's going to want it eventually. And so these start piling up when we look at those, some of the things that we kind of want to pay attention to, obviously a sudden change in attire, change in attitude, change in behavior, change in relationship, personal hygiene. All of these things compounding when we start looking at these elevate our risk factors. Next week, we'll talk about cognitive interviewing and polyvictimization. We'll start deep diving into some of this stuff that could lead us to different questions that we may ask that would elicit responses that may throw a red light off in our head that says, this is interesting, right? So we want to make sure that we look at those type of things in regards to it. So traffickers don't discriminate based on gender, race, social demographic. They just don't. You know what? They look for somebody who is most vulnerable. You're not going to see somebody walking around that has a t-shirt on that says, I'm a trafficking victim. It's not that easy, right? So there's no exact mold that fits what a trafficker or a trafficking victim looks like. I want you to think in your head what you think a trafficker looks like. Find that model, what you think a trafficker looks like, and picture that for a second. Last year, a 14-year-old girl who was in foster care, staying at a house, ran away from home because of the only reason she didn't feel like she was getting enough attention. She was the 10th of 10 children who were all at this home, foster care. Now, the family wasn't abusive. The father owned a construction company. They were very well to do. The mother was just trying to save the world, and she wanted to take care of foster kids and provide them with a home and a place to sleep. And she didn't fit in with the other 9 kids and just decided to up and leave. And she did. She left. She ran away in the middle of the day. She ran away on Saturday, walked away from the house on Saturday, walked down the street and got on a bus where she met a 64-year-old white female who was riding the bus as well, who said, "Are you running away from home, dearie?" And she says, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She goes, "Do you need a place to stay?" And she goes, "Maybe for the night." And she goes, "You're more than welcome to stay with me." She takes her home. She cooks her a home cooked meal. She stays there with her. The next day, she trafficked her out to three men on her apartment floor to pay for rent. Now, did this 64-year-old white grandmother fit the mold of the person you thought might have been a trafficker? No trafficker has a mold. They're all the same, right? I mean, they're not all the same. Okay. At risk groups are certainly more susceptible to being trafficked. And we covered those at risk groups, those groups who are the most vulnerable. Those are the ones we want to be concerned about. So, where do we see this at? Because you're like, all right, Rich, are they just going to walk in my office? Where do we see sex trafficking? Where do we see labor trafficking? Where do we see domestic servitude here in the United States? Well, one of the things that we're starting to see is we're starting to see the landscape change. Okay, we're starting to see things change as far as where this is happening. And if you remember earlier, I told you about an upward of 60% of trafficking victims meet their trafficker online. Sometimes this happens in chat rooms. Sometimes it happens on social media sites. Sometimes it happens, anywhere. But where is the once they're recruited? Now, where is this happening? Well, there used to be a site online called Backpage.com, and on Backpage.com, you could go on there and you could buy a couch, a kitchen table, or a girl. All right. It was much like Craigslist. So, those of you familiar with Craigslist. So, Backpage was being used to facilitate prostitution and sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The government decided we're going to shut this down. We know this site's being used to facilitate crime. Well, keep in mind, Backpage.com, and this is $150 billion a year business, right? So Backpage decides we're just going to open up what we call eBackpage.com. We're going to host it outside of the United States, and we're going to provide the same services only through the different server. It's $150 billion a year business. It's a little bit harder to shut it down than just locking up a website. As you can see on here, in the United States, you can list by state and you could go by city. So if you're searching for something, let's just say hypothetically, I'm looking to go to DC. I can search here. I can do Northern Virginia, Washington, DC, Southern Maryland. I can click on escorts, massages, men seeking women, whatever I want to that's on this website. I can click and then I could go to these links and I can find the links of where these individuals are. And interviewing trafficking victims, a lot of the victims will say to me, you can see which one of these messages was written by, and she would say, a legitimate prostitute, and which one was written by a trafficker, because no female is going to talk that way about her body. But a male who's putting her on there to sell her for sex will do that because it's not his body. So he will talk degrading and vulgar. So you can easily go through there and pick that out. So we kind of created a system so that we could go through there and kind of cherry pick through what might be considered a victim and what might not be. This is just one site, right? Then here's another site. This is called Body Rubs Map. And this is a listing of all of the massage parlors across the United States. It's estimated as roughly 25,000 illicit massage parlors in the United States. 25,000. Doesn't mean every massage parlor you see on your street in your neighborhood is illicit. I'm just telling you, there's 25,000 of them. Okay. So you can search it. I just did one by Tennessee. You can go through there, same scenario, boom, and list it on there just like that. Social experiment. Just simply throw your Google browser up at some given point today and type in escort and see how quickly you will get 1.5 million returns within 0.4 seconds on Google in your area. How do you police this? So I say all these things just to demonstrate to you the magnitude and how prolific this problem is, right? Labor trafficking. Where are we seeing labor trafficking at in the United States? 50 million people live in conditions of modern day slavery. 50 million people. More than half are in labor conditions, with child labor being about 3.3 million. So when we look at this, where do we see this in the United States? Okay, factories, migrant agriculture work, exotic dancing, magazine sales, restaurant work, hotels, food processing, construction, landscaping. I'm not saying everybody who's out mowing your yard is being labor trafficked, but there is a high potential that is quite possible that they are. I'll give you a little demonstration here. So, a case that we'd worked on, this individual actually was from Nicaragua, and he was actually recruited by an individual who was also from Nicaragua, who had a construction company in the United States. Mr. Lopez went back to Nicaragua and recruited his neighbor to come back to the U.S. to work for him in his construction business. And he does. He comes back to the United States. He works for him. He put him to work building homes. And during such, he would drive him to work every day, and he would drive him home every day. He allowed him to live in this house and shared a room with another worker, where he charged him an upwards of $400 a week to live in the house, $25 a week to use the washer, $25 a week to use the dryer, $50 a week to use the refrigerator, $15 a week to use the plug to charge his iPhone. As you can quickly see, he had no money at the end of the week because Mr. Lopez was just taking it all back from him. Also, he was deducting his transportation fees to bring him to the U.S. So during the course of the fact that he was working 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, he accidentally cut his finger off. Was taken to the hospital. Mr. Lopez drops him off and says, "You're of no use to me anymore. If you tell the police, remember, I know where your family lives in Nicaragua." So not an uncommon story, to be honest with you, at all. So when we look at this, we know that 70% of people trafficked for labor are foreign nationals, and 50% are from Latin America. So when we look at the crisis that's going on at the border, right, we look at those push and pull factors. We know that 50% of those being trafficked in the U.S. come from that pipeline. 50%. Many of these individuals will not self-identify, right? Many of them will not self-identify as a victim. And this is why it's so particularly difficult for us to work investigations focusing on labor trafficking, because people will not self-identify for this, because they're being pulled to this country for a better life, more money, more opportunity, right? They're being pushed here because there's no opportunity in their country. There's violence, drugs, no health care, lack of education, poverty, etc. Then when they get here, they're willing to be exploited because they don't want to go back to their country. So they're not going to self-identify as a victim in regards to this. We know that the pandemic really affected a lot of different things. I want you to think about when you drive home or drive to the grocery store, how many help wanted signs you see out there. It'd probably be easier to post up help not wanted. It'd be probably fewer signs, but everybody's looking for jobs right now. And these individuals are also looking for jobs, and they are being exploited in regards to it. It's created such a perfect storm for this. Particularly, we're starting to see a lot of these individuals who have immigrated into the U.S. who are lying about their age, and they're working underage. We had worked an investigation in Iowa where these individuals were going to school during the day, and at 4 o'clock when they got out of school, they worked from 4 to midnight in a meat processing plant because they worked through a staffing agency. They were 14, 15, and 16-year-old kids. So when we look at the prosecution angle of this, 70% of the people who are being trafficked for labor in the U.S., but only 30% are being trafficked for sex. So there's kind of an imbalance here, right? In the past 20 years, we have only prosecuted 7% of those cases. So we heavily focus our efforts on sex trafficking, not necessarily focusing that much on the labor trafficking aspect of it. So when we're like, what do we, how do we identify these type of individuals? We want to make sure that we look for some of the common factors, avoiding eye contact with employers and outsiders. And I was talking with one of the victims one time, and I was like, why, why is this a thing? Why won't you look at me when I'm talking to you? And he's like, well, several reasons. Like, when I don't look at my employer because I'm fearful. of what he will do to me. But I don't look at other people because I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed of the situation that I put myself and my family in, and so therefore I don't make eye contact with them. They're not in control of their own documents because their trafficker will keep those documents so they can't leave. And then often they'll tell them that if you do leave, I'll turn your documents over to law enforcement and say that you're here illegally. They have a lot of untreated injuries, malnourishment, fatigue. Think about this. These individuals are being exploited for labor. If they're at the hospital, they're not working. And if they're not working, they're not making money. Lack their own transportation. Here's one myth that is, that actually is true. A lot of people say, well, if you see a white van and it's got a bunch of people in it, they're probably being trafficked. Probably, because their movements are restricted and they're controlled. The trafficker likes to control them from the time they leave the house to the time they go to the business, from the time they go to the business back to the house. Wear the same clothes repeatedly, probably because they don't want to pay $25 a week to use a washing machine. Remember when I talked about Mr. Lopez charging them to use the washer and dryer. Often doesn't speak English. Sometimes when we look at this, 70% of trafficking victims are not from the United. 70% of the labor trafficking victims are not from the U.S. And there is that language barrier. Because there is that language barrier, they're really unaware of their surroundings. They're also unaware of the services that are provided to them. They're unaware of the services that are available to them. So that language barrier plays a huge role in regards to that. Domestic work. Where do you see domestic work at in the United States? When we say domestic work, we mean housekeepers, nannies, cooks, things like this, right? What are you going to do? Go knock on every door and say, hey, excuse me, do you happen to have somebody in here who's a domestic slave? It's one of the most clandestine ones. And I'll talk to you a little bit about this case, Mrs. Lucazon. So Mrs. Lucazon came to the United States to be a nanny. She answered an ad. She came to the United States from the Philippines to become a nanny. She did become a nanny for his family out in Los Angeles, California. And she took care of the kids until the kids were grown and left the house. Mrs. Lucazon slept on a concrete floor in the garage. She got to eat the food that was left over from the meal. And I don't mean the food that was left over from the meal. I mean the food that was left over on the people's plates after the meal. She was taken to the hospital because she was suffering vertigo and malnutrition. And Mrs. Lucazon was from the Philippines, so she didn't speak English. Lo and behold, by divine intervention, the nurse that took care of her at the hospital was also from the Philippines and spoke her language. She explained to her the story. And she explained to her that she'd been to the hospital 2 or 3 times before, but no one had ever asked her these questions. The nurse, by chance name was Mercy, came out to the house when the Cox were not home and took pictures of the conditions that she was living in and told her story to us. And when we looked into the investigation, some people always ask me, what's the hardest case you've ever worked? And I said, this case right here. I said, she was 78 years of age. She had been a domestic slave for 37 years. How do you give somebody 37 years of their life back? It's a pretty difficult task. Afterwards, and we'll talk a little bit about Ms. Lucazon next week, in the fact that she had developed a trauma bond with her traffickers. And when I went and interviewed her a year later, she was wondering when she was going to go back to that house. And I was like, never. So we'll talk a little bit about trauma bond next week. But this case is real. What we're starting to see now change is sex trafficking of youth online. Huge concern for us because we know that this offers an anonymous approach for traffickers. We know that the pandemic, whether it's over, it's not over, it's back, we're just going to have to live with it, etc. COVID-19 really made more people vulnerable, especially it pushed more people online. And those of you who have kids know that you can't give them a privilege and then take it away. So it's not like they were online 100% of the time and now they're not online close to 100% of the time, because they are, right? I just know that this is an extension of their hand now. I mean, they might as well come out with this in their hand. So because it's there, and that's what they do. They're constantly on it. And because you're constantly on it, you become a little bit more susceptible, right? So spending more time online makes it a little bit easier. We know that tips to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children doubled during the pandemic, and it's still at its highest rate right now. We know that traffickers took advantage of this aspect. I would imagine that not everybody on here understands every app that's on your kid's phone, what it's used for, right? What the dangers are of those apps. I met a trafficker, interviewed a trafficker who met his victim on Facebook in a Christian chat room. So one would think that if your kid's in a Christian chat room on Facebook, they'd probably be safe. But there's really no place safe online that, unless it goes unmonitored. We start looking at this 93% of teens go online, right? 7% clearly live under a rock. I would venture to guess that 93% is much higher than that. So when we look at some of these statistics, I think it's pretty, I don't want to say daunting, but pretty clear, the susceptibility rate for these kids being online. 1 in 20 children admitted to arranging a secret meeting with someone they met online. 1 in 20. I was given a lecture at Herndon County Schools outside of DC this past year, and there, probably a couple thousand students in there. And I said, and all the teachers were lined up around the edge of this auditorium, and they were all in the stands. I said, how many of you have ever met anybody online that you didn't know before and carry a conversation out with them? And everybody raised their hand. I'm like, that's pretty normal. How many of you have ever agreed to meeting that person in person after you met them online? About 75% of them raised their hand. And all of the teachers' mouths hit the floor. 75% of these kids agreed to meeting someone they did not know in person after meeting them online. So, oftentimes these are things we need to be concerned about. This young girl, Alice, for Christmas got a virtual reality quest game. When she did this virtual reality quest game, she met a guy who told her he was a 14-year-old boy from Scotland, carried out a conversation with him on virtual reality quest. Those of you who are unfamiliar with this, it's a virtual reality headset where you play games online through VR technology. And that gravitated to talking on Snapchat, and then gravitated to talking on the phone. And her mother recognized that she spent a lot of time in the bathroom and was concerned for her health, and started listening in and seeing if she was okay and what was going on. And she started putting two and two together, realized she was in the bathroom talking to somebody. This individual, this 14-year-old boy from Scotland, told her to go to the bathroom to carry out conversations, because the parents won't interrupt your conversation because they'll think you're just using the restroom. And another fact, he wasn't a 14-year-old boy from Scotland. He turned out to be a 44-year-old male from Scottsdale, Arizona, who recently was just released from prison for abduction. And Alice had enabled her locale, so he knew where she lived. So the dangers of online exploitation are pretty real. It's unfortunate that there are heinous people out there. We have to protect our kids, but why recruitment online? We said in an upward of 60% of trafficking victims met their trafficker online. And it's important for us to understand it's easier for them. It's easier for the trafficker to have 15 screens open, talking to 15 or 100 different people in order to do that, right? These apps allow them some, anonymous nature. You can post a picture of anybody. They can say they're anybody online, okay? And the kids relatively believe it. We do provide a course for those of you who's online. It's free on online exploitation, on how to, keeping your kids safe online. And I'll give you guys the link to that if you want to take it or take it with your kids. I think it's an important step in not burying your heads in the sand and having that ostrich like, oh, my kids aren't doing this. My kids aren't talking to people online, etc. Just you might as well admit that they are in regards to this.
JD, gaming and talking to people online can be risky. Have you heard about online exploitation?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
What do you know about it?
I know that kids will send photos to each other or online and they'll get blackmailed.
Right. It's where they send nude photos to each other or sexual videos. And it's not just with kids at school. There are actually people online specifically targeting kids and teenagers on games and apps like what you're using. And they do it just to exploit them. They'll build a relationship with them and then invite to meet them offline. And when they do, they'll either try to get money from them or they'll sexually abuse them. Have you heard of any stories about this before?
No, not really.
I've heard a few recently, and there was one about a girl just the other day who ended up meeting somebody on a virtual reality quest game. Do you know games like that?
Yeah.
She ended up making friends with somebody online, and he said he was 14, but really he was twice her age. He talked to a lot of girls online. Over time, he would video chat with them, and then somehow he persuaded them to send nude photos of themselves or sexual act videos. And then he would use that to blackmail them.
So that was actually taken from an excerpt from Keeping Kids Safe in a Digital World. So actually based on real investigations that we have done in regards to it. I highly recommend it if you haven't taken an online course to do that. Just to educate yourself and familiarize yourself a little bit more with this aspect of it. Obviously, you can find it located here at this site, but I'll also send this information to Karen so she can have it so she can distribute it to a wider population. You can scan this QR code to evaluate this training. I'm going to open up the floor for questions now for anyone who might have any questions in regards to this.
We did have one question about whether or not they could have a copy of this slideshow.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide that. Happy to send that to you for wider distribution to folks. I'll also provide some additional resources as well. In my email address too. I welcome you to use me as a resource for anybody who's on here. If you need additional information about something, I'm pretty sure I have it. So I'm happy to provide that to you just as a resource for you to have.
And then somebody wanted to know, you had mentioned a link. Teresa Merch wanted to know if you could provide the link you mentioned. Teresa, which link was that?
Was it the link to this training right here?
Yes.
Yep. If you scan this QR code with your phone, it'll take you right to the Learning Academy. On this Learning Academy, there are several different platforms for people to take, and most all this training is accredited with either get post certification or for you guys CRE credits, whatever. And it's certificate based.
The next question is, does Hope for Justice offer opportunities in the Hampton Roads area to get involved and volunteer?
Yeah, we have an East Coast office located in Charlotte, North Carolina that handles the East Coast corridor. And they can go online and there's a volunteer app on the Hope for Justice website that they can sign up for.
And what is your last name?
Yeah, it's Schoeberl. I'm going to put this in the chat for you guys. I don't know why I haven't done that already, but apologize. I'll go ahead and put it in there for you guys.
It's listed with your name right on the screen.
Oh, is it?
True too.
Yeah.
Okay.
I missed it. Sorry about that. I didn't see it on the screen.
That's okay. I didn't either. So there.
It's right underneath. There's your picture, and then it says who you are.
I don't see that. I don't have that view right now.
So
Thanks.
do you see your name on there that says TMURCH?
I see it up at the top of the toolbar. But I'm not now. I see it because I had to move the arrow. It wasn't.
Oh,
visual.
gotcha. Yeah,
Minimal. It was limited.
I was doing that too. I was my pictures of the people were crowding it.
I think this is a hugely needed training. I don't know exactly all the avenues that you are able to, and get into as far as schools, etc. I know there's like, Civil Air Patrol, there's Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all kinds of children, um, agencies that could really use this training, as well as, just parents in general. I know, there are a number of parents that I work with, both as a therapist and even in my private life, that I know that have been seeking a really good training to help their children to understand the dangers.
Mhm.
Because there's so many access, so many workarounds. Like they put on all these parental guards, and these kids figure out how to work around them. And it's a genuine concern for a lot of people that I work with, and a lot of people that I know that have, young children and teenagers.
I will say that this digital course is made for both parents and children. It also comes with some supporting documentation. It also has an online agreement that's on there, if that's for parents and children to agree to, like an online contract on things of what they can do. I can tell you that burying our heads in the sand is not the answer to this. Becoming more educated about the dangers that are out there and recognizing that fact is extremely important. You would be very hard pressed. You had mentioned that other people would benefit from this training. You'd be very hard pressed not to find an industry where human trafficking does not intersect with. We do training for every industry. It's a $150 billion a year business. So we know the financial institutions clearly benefit from it. So we've designed a training that's specifically for financial institutions. We also design them for healthcare. We know that an upward of 88% of trafficking victims have been to a healthcare provider and have gone unrecognized by that provider as a trafficking victim. So we know that that's a crucial industry. We know that hotels and motels are extremely beneficial. Schools are extremely beneficial. The average age of exploitation is between the ages of 12 and 14, right? So we need to look at getting these kids that are between the ages of 12 and 14 this type of education, not waiting till after they're out of high school. Making it more real for them to understand what those dangers and how those dangers exist, and what makes them most susceptible to falling into that funnel.
Well, is there a collaboration at all with working between the human trafficking and knowing that a huge link is social media and being able to offer, I've talked to a number of people that have used parental guards, whether where they get their phone or whatever, and then their kids seem to be able to find a workaround. I think it was, I don't want to say because I can't remember exactly, but one avenue of social media, the parent can say they can do a time of how many minutes. And a parent was telling me that when that time limit comes up, it offers to ignore the time completely or extend it by another 15, 30, etc. time. So that's given to the child on the phone, even though the parent may have limited time. So there's a lot of these parental guard apps and things that are supposed to be safeguard that I've been being told by the people I work with that it's a false security because there's so many different ways to work around it.
Yeah. Every app out there is going to have a workaround. These kids are going to figure it out. It's just going to take a little additional due diligence on the parents' aspect of it. I will recommend there is one app out there. It's not associated with our organization, but it's called Bark. And
Bark?
Bark. Yep, like the dog Bark. And it does work as a means to send the parent notifications if the individual accesses certain mobile apps that may not be age appropriate for them. Particularly some of these live streaming apps are extremely concerning. I'll also send out to Karen that she can distribute widely a list of apps and then what those apps are known for and why they're dangerous. or have the potential to be dangerous. But know that any app has the potential to be dangerous if these kids continue to go on monitored online. But that's the important thing, is making sure that they don't have full reign. I mean, I always tell people, when I was growing up as a kid, my parents always warned you about stranger danger. If a car pulls up, don't go up to their window and talk to them, blah, 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 blah. But yet we let our kids go up and talk to people in this window, which is much deeper and much more contact. It just seems that like we think that nothing will happen to our kids, but they're all susceptible. It's a game of statistics.
I've used that as an example with some parents that are hesitant. Well, I think I should trust my children. I don't know, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, look, you lock your doors of your house every day. But yet this gives people access to your children, like they're walking into your house without there being any kind of security. One of the people I work with told me how their teenage child realized that if there's parental restrictions on a phone, that if you enter in, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but the way she explained it, you change the language. If you change it from English to Spanish, you can go anywhere you want. And once you get into wherever you want to go, you can change it back to English. And that her child was actually, kids were paying her child to tell them the workaround, which didn't last very long. I mean, a few people paid and then they told everyone, at school what the workaround was. But can you imagine that you think you're a parent, that you put safeguards on, and all it takes is your child to change the language medium in order to have full access to everything you're trying to protect them from?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, kids are, when they want something bad enough, they're pretty genius in order to figure it out. So it's a continual battle. It's just like I always tell people that, online, it's like mowing your yard. You just don't mow it in April and you're done for the year, right? Continue to mow it week after week after week. Monitoring your kid is the same way. You're going to have to continually monitor them and not just set it and then leave it.